I'm Tovey, and this is the Full Story Newsroom edition. It's been almost 2 months since the US and Israel launched a war on Iran, unleashing violence across the region and chaos in the global economy. One of the strange and definitely unintended consequences of this war, though, especially as far as Donald Trump is concerned, has been a renewed focus on green energy. With me to discuss this today is Gabrielle Jackson.
Hi, Joe. Who would have thought Trump might be the one to spark a huge rise in electric vehicle sales in Australia?
Exactly. And visiting us from Hobart this week, we have our climate and environment editor, Adam Morton.
Hello. It's good to be up on the North Island briefly.
So, as oil prices have exploded over the last couple of weeks, electric vehicle sales have boomed. All global crises have a way of changing society in ways we often don't see coming. So this week on the podcast, I want to talk about whether the oil shock delivered by this devastating war is also an inflection point for electric vehicles and for renewable energy more generally. Now, Adam, you wrote a piece for us back in early March headlined, "If there was ever a moment for Australia's shift to renewables and EVs, this is it." What did you mean by that?
I'm not sure I used this language at the time, but I think the thing underlying it is that we are talking about the fuel crisis and the energy crisis that has flowed on from the Iran war. And the reality is it's a fossil fuel crisis. And I think that's how we should be describing it. And the message from that is that fossil fuels are fundamentally unreliable. So, this is the second fossil fuel crisis we've had in 4 years. We had gas prices go through the roof after Russia invaded Ukraine. And now we've seen with the US and Israel war on Iran and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, liquid fossil fuel prices, diesel and petrol going through the roof. So what we have here is an unreliable market, which we cannot control in Australia. Whatever we do, we're not going to be able to avoid this sort of thing happening again just by shoring up a bit more supply coming internationally. There's always that risk. It's a supply of a dirty fuel that we have committed as a country to get off, right? And there's very good evidence that we need to do that as quickly as we possibly can. So perhaps we should, the response should be how quickly on the back of this can we actually make that change? The point was really there's a bunch of things we could be doing. Maybe let's talk about them.
Yeah. All right, well, let's just step through this issue a little bit. Gab, so how have we seen Australians responding to soaring fuel prices over the last 2 months? What is happening with EV sales?
So to answer the first question, I think there was a lot of fear and panic at first, especially with people who have to use their cars. A lot of people do, especially in regional areas. And we've talked before on this podcast about fuel being like an inelastic cost. Some people just have to use it. We've talked to people who have trucking businesses that are really struggling, home care nurses who need to use their cars. And I don't think we can lose sight of the very real desperation that these really high costs, play in people's lives. But on the other hand, we have seen a dramatic rise in the cost of electric vehicle sales. Even the second-hand market is booming. One auction house had a 20% increase in second-hand EV sales just in March compared to February, and I think that's increasing even more. And, I don't think that's a surprise. When people can see the benefit of a change, they don't mind the change. And the benefit now of running an electric vehicle compared to a combustion engine is so clear that people have really jumped on it. Jonathan Barrett, our business editor, interviewed a guy who had been a bit of a skeptic for electric vehicles who's now bought one. And he summed it up really quickly and simply. He said, it's cheaper to run, more convenient to run, and it has no vehicle emissions.
I think that's absolutely true. We've seen an increase in demand. I don't know how much that's come through in the overall figures yet, but I think it will. March was a small uptick on last year, but I think when we see the figures for April, it's likely to keep rising. And I think perhaps the most interesting part of that is actually been a doubling in the second-hand market, which barely existed, and that really needs to take off to make this available to more people.
Makes it more accessible.
Yeah, it has to, and again, it has to become more accessible. And one of the reasons so we're going to see a big jump, but I think we really need to stress that this is still off a low base because we're pretty unprepared for this. And despite years of evidence and advice to governments about the economic benefits of doing more to support this shift, we're only just still at the ground floor.
Yeah, what is this crisis kind of exposed about where we were at with electric vehicles, and could the government be doing more now to help speed up this transition, do you think, Adam?
Look, there are certainly things the government could be doing. I mean, I think, like as Gab said, we should acknowledge that understandably their first focus has been acting and being seen to act on ensuring up diesel and petrol supplies. It's been a slightly strange situation, right? We have seen prices skyrocket even though we haven't had a shortage. There are a shortage in particular places, but it's more about people panic buying or just shoring themselves. That can be an unfair way to describe it, shoring themselves up about what might lie ahead, rather than at the moment a shortage in supply, though that could still come because who knows, right? So I totally get why the government is acting on that and why Anthony Albanese is flying to our trading partners in Asia to shore up deals. I think what we'd want to see now, and hopefully with the budget coming up, that might be the moment, what more we could be doing to accelerate electrification. And part of that is EVs, but part of it is also, where we use a lot of the diesel in this country, which is at mine sites. Mines are the biggest user of diesel in Australia. The biggest user of diesel in the mining industry are coal mines. We really could be doing more to encourage electrification there. And there's obviously another question about how much we should be still supporting coal mines with subsidies. And then trucking. We have huge, obviously we're a vast country. We rely on trucking to get goods around the country. We could be doing much more to drive electrification there. We could be doing much more to encourage the growth of the second-hand market. The laws on parallel importation of EVs from other countries, they are tighter here than some other countries, New Zealand, for example.
What is that? People always talk about parallel importation.
Well, it's just about what EVs you can bring into the country under what circumstances. And it's been, you have to jump through a lot of hoops in Australia. I suspect that's an area where the government will look to move. And then there's stuff you could do around just stop subsidising use of diesel in big mines, multinationals, because we want them also to electrify their operations. Well, if we're subsidising diesel, that's obviously a deterrent to do that. So let's maybe, make it less attractive to use fossil fuels, more attractive to use
But just how
electric
diabolical
vehicles.
are the politics around removing those subsidies now? I mean, I know that's something you've written about a lot, but in this moment...
I think that it's unlikely the government will go down that path. I think that the idea that... Do you really think the politics would be bad if they said we're going to stop subsidising multinational mining companies who are paying less for their diesel than, tradies, people who drive on roads?
I guess it's how you make the argument.
I think the argument could be made. I'm not at all persuaded that it will be made. There was a real fight. There's been a discussion within government about it. I suspect it will lose. I think the case hasn't got any less strong because of what was happening, though.
But it does make it difficult for them when farmers then start saying, well, what about us? Because farm machinery uses a lot of diesel too.
That's right. Yes, sometimes there's been a blanket push to get rid of that subsidy for everyone who gets it, and it's not just mining companies, it is farmers, it's tourism operators. I think that you could focus it quite clearly on the biggest users of the diesel, these wealthy companies that have made commitments around electrification. Some of them are going backwards on that. We have other government policies meant to drive that. This is working in the opposite direction. Logically, I don't think it makes any sense. We probably should acknowledge that the argument for that subsidy being in place is they say that fuel excise is meant to pay for roads, and they're not driving their vehicles on roads. But in reality, it all just goes into the budget, mostly, the overwhelming majority of it, and you can fund roads in a stack of ways. So I don't think that argument stands up. So, there's a bunch of things you could do quite quickly to make a change.
Yeah. Another policy change we thought might be in the mix for this budget, if you were listening to the government a year ago, was a tax on road users, which would apply to all cars, replacing the tax on petrol and diesel. Last year, Jim Chalmers said this was an idea whose time had come, but the government's cast doubt on that lately, haven't they?
Yes. We've heard noises from Catherine King, the Transport Minister, and Jim Chalmers Not saying that they wouldn't do it, but maybe giving the impression now's not the moment.
And that would be effectively to keep electric vehicle sales booming.
That's right. To
Yeah.
not introduce a deterrent. I mean, some people have argued, and I think the New South Wales government has argued that it wouldn't be a deterrent. Well, I think it's a pretty brave argument to suggest that adding an additional cost and probably a logistical exercise you have to go through to monitor how much you're driving wouldn't be a deterrent. Why would we introduce a deterrent for something we want to really escalate at the moment? So I think that's a good sign from the government, and hopefully that will be delayed. I mean, I think we should need to get past this idea that we must replace fuel excise with a road user charge on EVs when we could, for example, for another issue in the public debate at the moment, maybe, tax windfall profits for gas companies a little more instead,
Well, we'll come back to that shortly. But just to stick with this for a moment, there's been a kind of another line of argument criticising the government. We've sort of talked a bit about how they could have been doing more to encourage EV sales before the crisis. But there are others who are saying that they're paying the price for having a too singular kind of, I've heard the term, one-eyed focus on renewables up until now, that there's been this sort of unedifying scramble to improve fuel supply, and that this crisis really only underscores how reliant we are on fossil fuels. What do you make of that criticism? Do you think that's fair?
No, I think it's nonsense.
It's bordering on farcical, I would say.
I would agree.
Please explain.
I mean, I think Adam's probably better to explain why than I am. But the idea that we're in a fuel crisis because we focus too much on renewables just makes no logical sense. But also, they haven't had a one-eye focus on renewables at all. Their safeguard mechanism policy, which is supposed to reduce companies' emissions, it hasn't actually worked. Adam wrote a story this week about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's early days with that, but it is designed. I would put it more. It's hard to see how this is the most efficient and sensible way to really introduce incentives to cut emissions. I mean, on the one-eyed focus on renewables, it seemed the underpinning thing for that seems to be that, like, and Barnaby Joyce has suggested this, that oil, a number of oil refineries shut when the coalition were in power. So we have less local oil refining capacity. The suggestion seems to be that this has happened because we were doing renewables, something tied with climate policy. It had nothing to do with it. It was just economics, right? We haven't got greater fuel reserves, in Australia because of renewable energy policy. Clearly that's not the case. That's been the same under both parties. Now the International Energy Agency has said we should have much greater reserves. Governments of both stripes have said, well, that will cost a stack of money, maybe $20 billion if we were to meet their target, and they're not going to put money into it. But that had nothing to do with going down the renewable energy path. Renewables have nothing to do with what we're facing at the moment. I think a lot of climate denialism has transferred itself now to arguing against clean energy solutions rather than taking on the science head on. There's always a problem with it. It's always to blame for everything, right? There are significant challenges in the transition to clean energy, but it is not causing any of the issues we're facing right now.
I think that's a big problem with turning this issue into a culture war, because there are real conversations that we should be having about the transition, about how to make it fair for people. A lot of people remember the transition, during the 80s and 90s to a globalised economy. People who lost their jobs because manufacturing and textiles closed down in the 90s never worked again. I think there's really important conversations about how we do this transition fairly that we're not having, because we're debating whether we need to have this transition at all. It sucks up all the energy and it stops us from having really important conversations.
I think that's absolutely right. Imagine if Parliament was focused on questions and debate about how to do the transition rather than reasons to not do the transition. I mean, I've been covering these areas a long time, and I feel like sometimes like we're still stuck in 2005. It's really remarkable.
Well, I think you could almost argue that the politics of this have got worse in the last few years and not better. I think, we've got One Nation, which is a party with no discernible climate change policies. They're really ascendant in the polls. They're kind of the tail wagging the dog on the conservative side of politics. Matt Canavan, who's a vehement opponent of net zero, is now leading the Nationals. The federal Liberal leader, Angus Taylor, recently declared that what Australia needs to do is dig and drill its way out of the crisis. The coalition walked away from net zero, of course. Where do you think the public mood is on this? And do you think the Conservative parties are tapping into something? Could this crisis actually harden Australians against renewables? Or do you think there's a misreading there?
I mean, the short answer is I don't know. And we obviously live in very polarised times, and that's, no sign that's going to slow down, I think. But I do think that people are smarter than we give them credit for. And I think the base, even if you don't understand all the moving parts, you're not paying close attention, that it's pretty clear that this is not a renewable energy problem we're facing right now. There has been polling that suggests that most people blame Donald Trump. Maybe he is a proxy as for other international forces as well, but he's sort of seen as the heart of it. There could be blowback against the government depending on how it handles it over time. And I think, with cost pressures, that's real. But I think there's a pretty clear argument that this is not about renewable energy, right? And if the government can't make that case, they're pretty bad at their job, because the evidence is so overwhelming. I do think that a lot of the public, even though we lived in divided times, remains ahead of our politicians and a lot of our media on this question, right? Maybe not across all the specifics of everything we need to be doing, but wanting more renewable energy, wanting more access to clean alternatives. I just don't see a government that's heading in that direction while managing the costs and the inequality questions, which they definitely have to, as Gab said. I just don't see them losing out on this.
I mean, I agree with you, Adam. I think the public is ahead of where most of the media is in Australia in this issue. And I think it's also obvious that this is not a crisis of renewables, but there is a really serious crisis happening, and strange things can happen in times of crisis. And I think it's going to be really difficult for the government to manage this and to be able to. They haven't always been very good at explaining the benefits of their policies. And I think that's something that they'll have to really focus on as we see what happens with this crisis. I mean, how is it going to end?
I think there's a possibility, though, that this helps take the politics out of some of these questions around EVs and renewables. Like, people can see the benefits for themselves. If you go and fill up a petrol car at the moment, prices are up at sort of $2.50 a litre. People are looking at electric vehicle cars not as a sort of a virtue signalling, sign of what you believe in or where you stand on the climate crisis. It's a purely economic decision people are making at the moment to try and buy an EV. So in that sense, I think there is a bit of a misreading of a public mood there, to not appreciate that it's hip pocket issues that are driving people towards renewables, towards EVs.
I think that's right. And we've seen that with solar, which is, really not a polarised political issue, rooftop solar.
Yeah.
And Australia is a world leader in it for a range of deliberate and accidental reasons and natural resource. But, and we're starting to see it now.
Pauline Hanson has solar panels, as you've reported, and others have reported.
And Matt Canavan has solar panels.
Yeah.
Yep. And we're now seeing it with household batteries. They are, Australia is world leading in the take-up at the moment. I think where the government could hurt itself here is if it continues to send a sign of mixed messages and timidity on this. You would like to think that our national conversation could handle both the fact that we need to shore up fossil fuel supplies at the moment and move as quickly to electrification as possible. I'm not sure that is a clear message that's coming in a way that everyone will hear it from all in the government. And, the Prime Minister is, famously cautious. And I think a cautious message could lead people being more confused than they need to be.
I also think it doesn't help that our media is so polarised and that a big section of our media is in denial about the benefits of this transition. That certainly doesn't help.
So finally, I just want to return to a point you made earlier about the potential new tax on gas giants, which was a policy which has gained a lot of traction on social media. There is a Senate inquiry underway. The Greens have been pushing for this. Seem to have a bit of purchase in the lead up to the budget. However, the fuel crisis has sort of created a new line of argument against that tax, saying that it's not the time, especially given how pivotal Australia's LNG exports have been in these kind of diplomatic dealings with our neighbours in Asia. Do you think that idea is now facing a sort of tougher battle in the face of the fuel crisis?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, and not for like logical reasons, because, putting a windfall profits tax on gas right now would necessarily, be an additional problem that Australia would face in this fossil fuel crisis. But I mean, we're quite clearly hearing the messaging from the Prime Minister that he is focused on locking in and shoring up quid pro quo deals with our trading partners in the region who supply us with liquid fossil fuels, and we supply them with gas. And I think the message is quite clear that he does not want to rock that boat. And my sense is the government was seriously looking at this, maybe not on the scale that, we've seen quite remarkable across the spectrum advocacy calling for this change. And I think there was a moment where we could have seen something significant if we did not have the Iran war, but I think it's quite unlikely. Maybe they'll still tinker with it, but it's certainly looking less likely than before.
And the gas industry is about to launch a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign trying to persuade the public of why this tax shouldn't happen as well.
The weird thing is I don't think that if a government decides not to go down this path, I don't think it's about the public. I think the public would be fine. I think it's about our trading partners.
But Adam, does that trading partner argument even stack up?
I mean, I don't know what's said in those conversations, but I don't think it's particularly compelling, right? We've seen, who are some of our big trading partners? Korea has a commitment, South Korea, to move off fossil fuels quite rapidly. Japan seems to be hedging its bets much more and tries to heavy Australia quite a bit to make sure that Japanese companies that are investing in gas projects in Australia will continue to have that access. But, and maybe is walking back on its climate commitments a little bit, but I don't think that there is any evidence that there is a real risk of supply to any of these countries. I just think we've seen governments, national and state in Western Australia, fall over themselves over a period of time to try and placate these trading partners in a way that seems to work against all of their commitments to act more rapidly on climate change. So no, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think it's likely. Do we really think these countries are going to stop sending us liquid fossil fuels if we say, well, we're going to put a bit more of a tax on windfall profits from the gas industry? No, I don't think that stands up. But I think we've heard messages from the Prime Minister that suggest that he may not be exactly where we are on it.
So now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. Gabs, what was it for you?
The Rebel Wilson defamation trial is just the most fascinating
Staggering.
trial I have followed in a long time. Obviously, I won't get into the legal issues, but I encourage you to read about the bath incident, which seems to have started the entire issue. It's just every day is some new, very juicy piece of gossip. There's no better way to describe it that takes my mind off the impending doom surrounding us.
That's what we need. Well, for me this week, it was something, I think it's a little bit doom related, but there was a beautiful piece of writing about it. So for me, it was this incredible investigation that we did here at Guardian Australia, led by Chris Norse, into the death of Bikram Lama, who was a Nepalese student who'd come to Australia and died a really tragic death at a Sydney train station. His body was left there for 6 days and nobody noticed. It was just a kind of a really harrowing story, beautifully told. But the piece then that really stayed with me after I read that story was a piece of writing that Bridget Delaney, our columnist, wrote about it, about the sort of breakdown in society when we stop seeing and acknowledging each other, and just how that act of seeing each other in public places, acknowledging people as people, is such a fundamental part of what it means to be a true society built on social relationships. And I just thought that was such a beautiful kind of humane take on it. It really stuck with me.
Yeah, me too. It was great.
Adam, what was the story for you this week?
So we're recording Thursday morning to break the fourth wall, and we heard this morning about the death of the broadcaster James Valentine, which really struck me and took me back. So I'm a Gen Xer. I'm not a Sydney-sider, so I don't have a lot of experience of him as what he became known for in recent decades as a talkback radio star. But I have really strong memories from my youth as he was the saxophone player in The Models and Absent Friends and other bands that I would watch on Countdown. And then he was the host of the afternoon show on the ABC when I was sort of a preteen and early teen, and later another show that I really liked short-lived called TV. And there's something, I mean, at any point in life, but particularly when you're young, that you have someone who is talking down the barrel to you every day of the week on television in a way that is relatable and insightful, and you feel like you're being talked to and not talked down to by an adult. That he was brilliant at it, right? And I have really strong memories of that. He was a terrific broadcaster. And I was just really sad to hear that he's gone. Though obviously, he's been unwell for a while, and it's in one sense good that his pain and suffering is over. But lots of love to his family and friends. If I could just pick one moment that I remember distinctly, him saying in the early 90s, looking down the barrel and declaring that The Simpsons was the best show on television in the very early days of The Simpsons. And I was like, you know what you're talking about.
He gets it.
Damn straight. You're here with us,
man.
us kids on the streets of Hobart.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought he was great. I was very sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I think that radio show on ABC Sydney in the last, few decades, he really just sort of made it feel like a neighbourhood, which I think is what good radio hosts do. You just sort of feel like you're part of something every time you tune in.
Absolutely. I think there are many tears in the streets of Sydney this morning. He had a real impact on people who listen to his show.
Yeah. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. And we do really want to hear from our listeners. If there is a topic you think we should cover or a question you want answered, you can reach us at australia.fullstory@theguardian.com. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you, Gabs.
Thanks, Joe.